Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing Plato's The Apology. This is an important work for several reasons. One of which is that Plato's conception of philosophy is pretty much the beginning of philosophy as we understand it. And The Apology is a very good introduction to some of the basic ideas of what Plato takes philosophy to be. That's one of the reasons. Here, Socrates is the main speaker, like in many of Plato's dialogues. And like in other places, Socrates becomes the embodiment of the philosopher. The way Plato paints the picture, Socrates is the good philosopher. To be a good philosopher is to do what Socrates does. And we see that very well in The Apology. In The Apology, we also see the basic story of Socrates' life. Socrates' philosophical life begins when a friend of his goes to the Athenian oracle and asks whether there is anyone wiser than Socrates. And much to Socrates' surprise, the oracle says no. Socrates is the wisest person in Athens. And Socrates is very puzzled by that claim because he has a lot of questions, but few answers. He's very aware of his own limitations. He's very aware of his ignorance. And he has a lot of questions. And he's puzzled by the fact that the article claims or says that he is the wisest person in Athens, when a lot of people around him, politicians, poets, religious leaders, claim to know a lot of stuff that matters. What is justice? What is wisdom? What is friendship? What is goodness? And so on. And Socrates thinks he doesn't really know what those things are. And yet people around him claim to know. And the article says that Socrates is the wisest person. So that begins the statement of the article begins Socrates' philosophical journey. He goes to those politicians, he goes to those poets, he goes to those religious leaders, and starts inquiring into the things that they say they know that matter. What is justice? What is goodness? What is friendship? And that is his philosophical career, going to people, talking to people that claim to know things and engaging in philosophical discussion with them. And what tended to happen was that Socrates was very clever. He was very smart. And a lot of these people that claim to know things, it turns out once they talk to Socrates, they didn't know as much as they thought. So crowds will follow Socrates as he engaged in philosophical discussion with these people. And at least from the perspective of those people, they were humiliated by Socrates because he would show in front of everyone that they didn't really knew as much as they thought they did. So that created some tension between Socrates and other people with power in Athens. And the Apology is the kind of record of Socrates' defense before the Athenian court. A lot of the people in power that were not very happy with Socrates going about, confronting them or asking them questions and then showing in front of an audience that they did not know as much as they said they did. A lot of those people kind of ended up accusing Socrates, and he ended up going to court. So the Apology is really a defense. Is the old meaning of the word. It's not the apology as in asking for forgiveness, but apology as in providing a defense of. So this work is an articulation of Socrates' defense of the accusations of those people that he spent a whole lifetime annoying by being a philosopher. So let's look at it more carefully. So the main accusation brought up against Socrates is that he is corrupting the youth. And it matters a lot. This is the first kind of important philosophical question that is addressed in the Apology. And that is exactly what Socrates says. The accusation is Socrates corrupts the youth of the followers, those that like to go along with him as he confronts, as he challenges, as he questions these people in political power that claim to know things. And the accusers think that what Socrates is doing is corrupting them. It's doing something that is undermining the good standing of those youth in the Athenian society. And then Socrates asks, what is this thing, corruption, that you think I'm doing to the youth? To corrupt someone is to make them worse off. What is that thing? And here's the way in which the accusers put it. Here's what the accusers think Socrates is doing to the youth, to the followers. So the accusers say, Socrates is corrupting the youth by teaching them the following things, teaching them to do the following things. teaching them to disrespect authority, namely them. Teaching them to challenge the established traditions, especially the stories about the gods, the Athenian gods. And those stories shaped a lot of the society of the time, a lot of the conception of what was good and bad, pious and impious, how should people live, what kind of roles people should play, and so on. So they shape kind of the society and the morality of the Athenians. And to have someone like Socrates ask questions about those traditions was perceived by many as a challenge, as a challenge to those very traditions. And when the youth that were following them were happy to, were following Socrates, were happy to do the same, the people in power tended to see that as a rise against the established traditions. So they saw it as a rebellion and something bad, something that was corrupting the goodness of the youth. But here's what Socrates says. Socrates says, that's not quite what I'm doing. I'm doing something similar, but that's a misunderstanding. Here's what I'm actually doing. What I'm doing is that I'm teaching the youth not to merely blindly follow their traditions, and crucially, the philosophical answers embedded in those traditions. I, Socrates, he says, I'm teaching them to think for themselves. I'm teaching them to not just blindly follow what their parents, what their religious leaders, what their people in political power, what others, those that perpetuate the tradition. I'm teaching them to not merely blindly follow that. I'm teaching them to think about the adequacy, the accuracy of the answers to those questions. Should we believe in the stories of the gods? Should we, comply with the relevant social mores and so on of the time? The accusers, the way Plato paints a story, just want to follow, to perpetuate the tradition that has answers to those questions. Socrates, the way Plato points it, is this kind of awakening of reason, this moment in history in which people, Socrates in particular, starts to not merely blindly perpetuate what's happened before, not merely prolong a tradition, but starts thinking about whether or not the tradition is accurate, whether or not there are the gods, whether or not the kind of rituals they perform are good rituals or bad rituals, whether they contribute to the human flourishing or not, to the happiness of the society of the group. So in opposition to the accusers who see being a good citizen as just following the tradition as established, Socrates sees himself in the role of the philosopher as not merely blindly following that, but actually thinking about the parts of the tradition that are good and the parts that are bad. So it's not the kind of simplistic opposition of perpetuators of tradition and people that rebel against it. Socrates thinks, Plato paints him, as there being this middle path, this better middle path of thinking about, of critically assessing the answers, philosophical answers embedded in the tradition, and retain what is good. So it's not about rebellion, and forego of what is bad. So it's not merely about prolonging a tradition. It's about building a better world by using reason as the guide to comprehending what is good and what is bad and what is right and what is just and so on. So here's what Socrates would say. I'm teaching the youth to be philosophers, to be lovers of wisdom, to be lovers of truth, to do things, not because that is what the tradition that they grew up in tells them they should do, but because they think about it and they recognize using the reason that that is what they ought to do, that that is the right thing, that is the good thing. So philosophy becomes, the way Plato paints it, this moment in which reason that is embodied by Socrates wakes up, and people no longer just blindly follow what has been done before them because it was done before them, but now reason thinks about what's the best way of doing things. And philosophy is the practice or the enterprise or the inquiry of trying to attain the truth. So Socrates is the paradigmatic philosopher that wants to know the truth, not just perpetuate what has happened before him. And that's at the heart of Plato. That's at the heart of philosophy, the way Plato sees it. And we still have philosophy more or less in those lines. So early on, there is this distinction, I think like page 1 of the dialogue begins, between what what Plato calls the sophist, and what, in contrast with the sophist, is Socrates, which is the philosopher. And if you read carefully throughout the dialogue, throughout the work, there will be different characterizations of what it is to be a sophist. In the way the way Plato paints it, the sophist is kind of the bad guy of the story, and that is kind of the mirror opposite of the good guy of the story, which is Socrates. And here are the main characteristics of the sophist. So the sophist is he who's intellectually vicious. He does not care about truth. He cares about something else. He looks like the philosopher. He's kind of engaging in dialogue with others in a way to try to persuade them or convince them that something is the case, some philosophical matter is the case, but not in the right way. There's something deficient about being a sophist. It's intellectually vicious. The sophist, says Plato, seeks pure persuasion. The point of engaging in dialogue with someone else, when the sophist is doing it, is not to attain the truth of the matter. It's not to figure out who's right. So if Socrates asks, are there really the gods as the Athenian poets paint them? The sophist would not try to answer the question in a truthful way, not try to know whether or not there are such gods, but rather he would already have an antecedent view on the matter, a preconception, and then he would engage in dialogue for the sake of merely convincing the interlocutor that he's correct. In other words, it's not knowing what's the case, it's not attaining truth that is driving the sophist. It's purely persuading the interlocutors, just convincing the other that you're right, regardless of whether or not you're right. You don't care about being right if you're a sophist. You just care about winning the argument. So a typical tool used by someone who seeks pure persuasion, a sophist, is strong rhetoric, sophisticated vocabulary for the sake of dazzling the interlocutor, showing that because they know a lot of big words, that that might be a testimony to their authority or their expertise, and therefore they should be trusted. Language becomes a means of kind of confusing things for the sake of appearing to be smarter or more intelligent or more well-informed than you in fact are, for the sophist. Importantly, reason becomes a mere instrument for trying to convince the interlocutor, not a guide to truth. And this came from the previous discussion. The way Plato paints the sophist is uncritical and unreflective. The sophist is someone who either blindly accepts the tradition and tries to perpetuate it, tries to defend the existence of the Athenian gods because he was brought up believing those things, or the opposite. But it's not because he thinks and questions and tries to inquire into the answers that the tradition instantiates or has, but rather because they just want to perpetuate it. So it is not assessing the tradition that is driving the sophist, that is merely defending it. So they're uncritical and unreflective in that regard. Though when they're talking, they seem to, it's not clear that they're defending truth, or they're just blindly defending the tradition. But to be a sophist is to be blindly defending the tradition, to be uncritical. They are clever. They want cleverness for its own sake. It's someone who wants to win an argument regardless of which side of the argument they happen to be. It is not knowing the right answer, but being able to win every time you engage in an argument. That's what's driving the sophist. And here's something that is actually not part of the description that Plato has. This does not appear in the Apology, but we contemporary people will put this front and center. So I want to put it up there too. Selective recognition of evidence. So journalists, unfortunately, or at least a lot of journalists, are notorious for already having views, political views, economic views, religious views. And then when they write their stories, they don't actually look at the world, at least a lot of them, don't actually look to see whether or not their view matches. They just they already have the conclusion in mind. And then they go and look at the potential evidence that justifies it. So they selectively recognize what supports their conclusion and selectively ignore the evidence that is contrary to it. And then they write their article, and yep, they point to a lot of evidence that supports the conclusion. And if the issue is complicated enough, then surely there will be some such evidence. But that's not the way of knowing the truth. That is just a way of presenting an article. But he who does that engages in selective recognition of evidence doesn't really care about knowing the truth. That's not what's driving them. That's not the reason for presenting an argument. That's not their reason for presenting an argument. So hopefully that paints a picture of the bad guy, the one who looks like the philosopher, but is not the philosopher. It's actually vicious, is doing something wrong. And the mirror opposite of that, the good guy, is the philosopher. He's the intellectually virtuous character. It is he who wants to, or she who wants to know the truth. That's what's driving. That's why he or she engages in philosophical conversation. It does not want, he or she does not want pure persuasion, but rather truth. When they ask a question, are gun rights, do gun rights exist? In other words, does a good society, is a good society one in which people are permitted to have guns or not, non-officials? When the philosopher asks that, he doesn't do that so that he can defend a view that he already has. He wants to know the truth. What does a good society look like? And then when he finds the answer, he wants to build a society. And the answer may or may not be the one that he has been brought up, the tradition that he has been brought up in. If he's a philosopher, he's willing to reflect upon, to think about, to inquire into, and attain the truth of the matter, not merely defend the view that he's been brought up to believe. He's been brought up to believe. When it comes to language, the philosopher does not want to dazzle the interlocutor by the use of vocabulary. The philosopher wants to make sure that he is understood. The point of language is to be understood, to convey a message. So the vocabulary will be as simple as possible, provided that it's the right word. Right? The point of using language is to be clear, to be precise, to be understood, not to come off as appearing to know more than you actually do. It is the content of what you say that matters, not the manner in which it is presented. At least that's Plato's philosopher. Importantly, reason is the guide to truth. The philosopher thinks about the matter, doesn't just defend his preconception, doesn't just ignore the evidence, in fact, looks at the evidence, questions whether or not, asks whether or not his traditions are the correct ones, and follows reason where it goes, follows the evidence where it leads. It reflects on received views. That's we see Socrates doing exactly that in the Apology. He's the one who's inquiring. He's not challenging as such the established traditions. He's inquiring. He's trying to assess whether or not the Athenian traditions about the gods, about morality, are the right ones. And he doesn't just accept them. He doesn't just rebel. He finds this middle path of inquiring, of trying to know whether or not those traditions are correct and to what extent they're correct if they are. He engages in dialectic, not just cleverness. He really talks to you. He listens to you. He wants to hear what you have to say. He thinks about your points. And finally, follows the evidence where it leads. So the philosopher is the good guy. The sophist is the bad guy. If you look at these characteristics, you should hopefully get a sense of what they both are. And the kind of imperative for our class is going to be something like, be the philosopher. When you find yourself disagreeing with a classmate, with the professor, with one of the authors in the readings, when you find yourself agreeing with a classmate, the professor, writes of the readings, ask yourself, is this because of the sophist kind of consideration? It perpetuates what I want to know. It enables me to do to support or defend some beliefs I antecedently have. Is that why I'm agreeing with this? Or is that why I'm disagreeing with this? Try to think of yourself as, try to understand the motivations behind your reasons, behind your accepting or not accepting some of the views you encounter. And ask yourself, am I being the philosopher? Am I inquiring into truth? Am I defending this claim about the good society, about what the God exists, or whatever philosophical question? Am I doing that so that I cannot know the truth of the matter? Or am I just unconsciously, unreflectively falling back on what I was told as I was growing up, defending my tradition? The philosopher does not blindly defend his tradition. He thinks about it. He wants to know. So the imperative is be the philosopher. That's why we have William Shakespeare here. To be or not to be. Be the philosopher, not to be the philosopher. Be the philosopher. So a lot happens in the Apology. And here's something I want to stress. This happens towards the end. And it's a cool argument. It's an argument that Socrates gives for why he's not afraid of death. And there are some major philosophical consequences or implications about this argument. So I want to look at it a bit more carefully. So here is the first claim. It is wicked and shameful to do wrong. So it's pretty straightforward. And Socrates adds, disobeying your superiors is one way of doing something wrong. Not all the time when your superiors have the right authority, but sometimes disobeying superiors is wrong. And he thinks he's in one of those cases. And here's a principle of action, a principle of wise decision making. It says, it is foolish to avoid what may be good for what is known to be wicked and shameful. So it's a principle of decision making when you have two alternatives. And one of them may be, one of those alternatives, alternative A, may be good. That's what you know about the alternative. The other alternative, alternative B, it's wicked and shameful. When you're in that position, two choices, here's what this principle says. It is foolish to go with option B, the one that is wicked and shameful. Here's the third claim. No one knows whether death is good or bad. Death may be good. Death may be the end of it all. You die, that's it, darkness, nothingness. Or perhaps, says Socrates, there's an afterlife. There's something good to be looked forward to. We don't really know, says Socrates. So maybe there is death may be good. But notice that if you put these three claims together, something logically follows. Q is a principle that says choose B when B is, when you have two options, and one may be good, and the other one to be wicked and shameful, choose the one that may be good. That's the wise decision. But if you look at 1 and 3, those are the options, right? 1 is, it is wicked and shameful to do wrong. And 3 is, no one knows whether death is good or bad. So in Socrates' case, Socrates was condemned to death. His defense did not go through. He was sent to prison. And his friends tried to rescue him. And his friends tried to take him out of prison and, bribe the guard and so he can walk out. And he said he couldn't, he shouldn't. He said that to walk out of prison and not face death would be foolish. And the reason it would be foolish is precisely because of this argument. Violating the law, in this case, walking away under a bribe, would be wrong, and that's wicked and shameful. Staying and taking the penalty will lead to death. But he understands the situation, and he thinks the wise thing to do is to face death, because that death may be good, and to walk away is wicked and shameful. So that's what follows. Therefore, it is foolish to do what is wrong in order to avoid death. And this is pretty grand, right? It's a grand conclusion. And I can put it a bit more generally. So more generally, virtue is better than avoiding death. Here we have a major philosophical answer to a deep philosophical question. Deep philosophical question, what makes life worth living? What makes a life a good life? And Socrates' answer is virtue. Be a good person. Develop your soul in the right way. Develop, being good. It is always better to be good than to avoid death. And it is foolish to think otherwise. If the options are avoiding death by being vicious, by doing the wrong thing, that's an act of cowardness, and you're being foolish when you do the coward thing. So it's a grand argument, grand conclusion. Before we conclude, I want to look at some more claims that I'm going to call Socratic wisdom. So here's Socratic wisdom. Remember the beginning of the story, Socrates says something like, how can I be the wisest person in Athens, given that I know almost nothing? I have a lot of questions, but very little answers. And if you remember, if you continue with the story, there's a point in which Socrates says, oh, I know what the article meant. And here's what Socrates tells us the oracle meant. The oracle meant that Socrates was wiser because he knew this. It is wiser to know that you do not know that which is worth knowing than to think you know when you do not know that which is worth knowing. So when Socrates, who thought he did not know what justice was, went and talked to a politician who thought he did know what justice was, and after Socrates engaged in philosophical conversation and showed that the politician merely thought he knew what justice was, but was mistaken about his belief. What came out of that philosophical dialogue was that Socrates was aware of his own ignorance. He knew he did not know what justice was. But the interlocutor, the politician, thought mistakenly that he knew what justice was. So Socrates came out to be the wiser of the two, not because he knew what justice was, but because he had this piece of wisdom, namely recognition of his own limitations. He knew what he did not know. And that's wiser than foolishly thinking you know what you don't. So Socrates thinks this is kind of his main contribution. This is his main Socratic piece of wisdom. And he kind of says at some points that that's the only thing he knows. That's the only piece of wisdom he has. But if you read more carefully, a lot of other cool claims that are legitimate candidates for wisdom come out. And here are some of them. And these are kind of presuppositions to make sense of the previous argument. For example, Socrates claims that the soul is more noble than the body. And don't read too much into the word soul. For Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the word soul just means something like the principle of animation of the body, that in virtue of which the body is alive. So for them, souls are empirically verifiable. You can see them. If someone's alive, they have a soul, that in virtue of which they're alive. We can think of soul more like personality or self. The body is, the Platonic body, is that which helps you to like kick balls, drink water, things like that. They're the bodily motions. That's the part of you in virtue of which you can do those things. You can kick a ball. The soul is the other part of you, the part of you that where your personality resides, the part of you in virtue of which you can have friends, care for someone, be morally responsible for your actions, know things, engage in free action, those kinds of things. What is a soul? Well, the thing in virtue of which you can do those greater things. And what Socrates is saying is that's the better part of you. To develop the body to have a healthy body is great, exercise and so on, go do athletic, engage in athletic activities is good for your body, wonderful. But it would be foolish to do that at the expense of the soul. He who has a great body, but a poor personality, lacks compassion, lacks kindness, is not a good friend, it's missing something important, says Socrates. It is better to have those good things of the soul than the body. And here's another major Socratic claim that counts as Socratic wisdom. The excellence of the soul, or the thing that makes the soul better, is virtue. In other words, your soul is better by you becoming more virtuous. That's what makes you have a better soul. And the thing that harms the soul, that corrupts the soul, that makes it worse off, is vice. He who is vicious has a worse soul. He who's virtuous has a good soul. And the soul is better than the body. So from these two claims, it follows that it is better to be virtuous than it is to have a very healthy body. Why? Because the virtuous person has the excellence of the soul, and the soul is better than the body. So major philosophical claims. From those philosophical claims, it follows that the lesser man or the weakened man can only attack the body. If someone's angry with you, if I have a student who they give me a paper and they think that the paper is wonderful, they deserve an A, but I read it carefully, I'm objective, I'm fair, and I give them a D, they might get very upset with me, and they might be vindictive. And the vindictiveness, the wickedness can manifest itself in different ways. But they're all, Socrates claims, are attacks of the body. The person can say, go to my car and like break it, or try to punch me in the face, or try to burn down my house, or something drastic like that. But Socrates says, notice the kind of thing that vindictive, wicked people do. They attack the body of the other. That's the only thing they could do. They couldn't harm the soul of the other. The student couldn't come and make me a worse person, morally speaking, couldn't make me vicious. That's something that I have control over, not the wicked student in my example. The wicked student can only attack my body. He has control over that, but not about my soul. I have control over that. I choose. The student can, for example, come to my office hours and say, hey, here's $1,000, give me a better grade. So it can offer me a bribe. And that would be to offer me an occasion for wickedness, for accepting the bribe. But he couldn't actually make me be wicked, right? I can always say, no, go and get out of my office. Keep your money. It is my decision to harm my soul by accepting the bribe and being wicked. The student cannot do that. He can only attack my body. He can punch me in the face. He cannot make me accept the bribe. That's my choice. That's what makes me a good or a bad person, or one of the things that makes me a good or better person. So because of, if you follow all of that, Socrates thinks the lesser man, the wicked man, the vicious man, cannot harm the better man. Can harm the body, but not the soul of the better man. The better man is the virtuous person. And the thing that makes the better man better, namely virtue, is untouchable by the wicked man. The wicked man can only attack the body, not the better part. So there's this kind of freedom or realization that the better part of your life is within your control, said Socrates. And here's something else that follows from these claims. Doing something wrong is harming oneself more than harming the other, the victim. So think of my student who gets upset because of the paper. He comes into my office, he offers me a bribe, and I say, no, I'm not gonna take it. I don't wanna be vicious. So he punches me in the face. He attacked my body, he hurt my body. Here's what Socrates claims. The wicked person harmed me, but, well, hurt my body. He didn't harm my soul. But the wicked person harmed himself more than he hurt me. Why? Because he made himself more wicked and more vicious by punching me. I just got a bruise. He got a worse soul. So he made the better part of himself worse off by the act of vindictiveness. It is foolish to do so, says Socrates, because now he's hurting his better part, namely his soul, for the sake of hurting my lesser part, which is my body. And that's a foolish decision because he's worse off than I am. My body's worse off, but his soul is worse off for the doing. The perpetrator of a wrongdoing, says Socrates, is always worse off than the victim of the wrongdoing, because the victim of the wrongdoing is just the body that gets hurt. The perpetrator is the soul, which is the better part. So it is foolish to do wrong all the time, not just to avoid that. The virtuous person, by comparison, creates occasions for developing a virtue. From all of this, it follows that death cannot harm the virtuous person, says Socrates. Death is the separation of the body and the soul. Maybe the soul dies with the body, your personality just ceases to be, there's nothingness, or maybe it endures. If it dies with the body, the death couldn't harm you if you're a virtuous person. Why? Because you just cease to be. To harm you is to become vicious, is to corrode the soul. And that's not going to happen in death, you're just going to cease to be. And if there's so that's option A, there's nothingness. Option B, there's an afterlife. And Socrates thinks the afterlife cannot harm you either, because the soul will be left behind. And the soul is where the wicked people attack, and the body will be left behind. And the body is where the wicked people attack, so there wouldn't be a body that to be attacked. And in the afterlife, much like in this life, it is only you that can hurt your soul. So death, even if whether you endure or not, cannot harm you. Whatever's after death cannot harm you unless you let it. So in some senses, very kind of optimistic and pleasant to endorse all the Socratic wisdom. Let's end here. Think about those things, and I'll see you next time.